Hello, everyone. Welcome. What a wonderful crowd we have here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. It's so lovely to see all of you, even on a snowy New York day. So good evening. I'm Kara Carmack, the Exhibitions and Public Programs Officer at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Spring 2023 Evening Lecture Series. We're thrilled to have Elizabeth Hazan, a Studio School alum, with us to speak about her work this evening. So welcome back, Elizabeth. Before we begin, I would like to note that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is free to the public with support in part by the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional funding is generously provided by the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and individual donors. Please consider making a donation to help keep our evening lecture series free by clicking on the support button on our homepage. Thanks to those of you joining us virtually and here on 8th Street. We'll reserve time at the end for Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. For our Zoom audience, please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. Elizabeth Hazan is a New York-based artist and the director of Platform Project Space. Her aerial landscape paintings mix gestural topography with elements of modernist abstraction. She was born and raised in New York City and attended Bryn Mawr College and the New York Studio School. She was awarded a fellowship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and has twice been a resident of Yaddo. Recent shows include High Noon at the Art Center at Duck Creek in East Hampton, New York, Heat Wave at Johannes Vogt Gallery in New York, and the two-person show Body to Land at Turn Gallery, New York. Her work was included in Psychedelic Landscape at Eric Firestone last summer. And she'll have a solo show, Sundown, opening on April 1st at the Maddow Conservancy in Sagaponack, New York, and will be included in a 3-person show at One Grand Army Plaza, curated by Heskin Projects, opening in mid-May. Now, please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Put on my glasses. I'm so happy to be back here at the school to talk about my work in a place that was so formative to my art making. I spoke here a number of years ago to interview Elena Sisto about her work, and I'm really thrilled to be here now talking about my own. I'm going to go through the evolution of my work since I was a student here, partially because we're at a school, and I think it's helpful for students to see the transitions as they happen in the work of artists over years, and partly because that's what I find interesting when I see artist talks. There was a show recently at Thomas Urban Gallery of work by Donna Nelson made over decades, and it was fascinating to see threads of future work in her earlier paintings and the choices she made. I grew up downtown New York City, and missed a whole circle of artists and writers who were larger than life characters with outsized personalities. My parents, Jane Freilicher and Joe Hazan, were both painters so I got a firsthand exposure to how artists spent their days and what the life of an artist entailed. I spent time in a wide range of artist studios and had a child's eye view on the whole scene. When I read 9th Street Women, I got a better sense of some of who these characters were when they were younger and how they came to New York. And it was really fascinating to consider them in a different way, with cliff notes I didn't get the first time around. However, growing up, there was no indication that I would become an artist, either to me or to my parents. Kenneth Koch, the poet who was a friend of my parents, did tell me years later that he bought a painting I made in a show I had in our living room when I was about 5. And he framed it and kept it, but that was really the extent of it. I think of the main activities of my childhood as wandering around with friends and reading books. My parents spent a lot of time out on the East End of Long Island, and they felt free to yank me out of school to accommodate when they thought summer should start. And the exposure to the landscape as it was in those days, flat and open, would stay with me. I studied English literature in college and wrote my thesis on Middlemarch. I wrote enough to know how hard writing is and decided to work in film, just because it was something I loved, but I wasn't really sure what it involved. There was no film department at Bryn Mawr, where I went to school, so I tried to cobble together some related things in my college summers. I took the NYU Sight and Sound film course. I worked at the factory for a summer, although they were shooting Andy Warhol's cable TV show then and no longer making any of those great films. I worked on a Laurie Anderson movie where I met Hal Hartley, who was the other art department PA, and then worked on a short film of his. I'm showing this image because it shows this is the entire crew that it took to make one small indie movie. This is not the cast. And you can compare that to an artist working alone in their studio. When I graduated and went to work for a very talented and hardworking set designer who was about 10 years older than me, and I really got a sense of what his life was like. I recommend to students that if they're thinking of working in a creative discipline, that they first try to be someone's assistant for a while, because you find out firsthand what their life is like. And at the end of the year, I couldn't see myself doing any of the things he did well and didn't want to spend my time shopping. I was 22 and I thought I had to decide right away what I wanted to do with my life. And it occurred to me that being an artist was a way to avoid all the waiting around time and other issues I saw in film. It appealed to me that you could just wake up and make something. It was direct, and I had a desire to do some kind of work where there was concrete evidence of my existence, something physical added to the world. There was a Hansel and Gretel aspect to art making, leaving a trail of crumbs behind you in the woods to know where you've been. I don't know if I want to carry that analogy out all the way and find out like who the witch is, but I showed I took some classes and I showed the paintings I had made to Rackstraw Downs, and he said, "You should go to the New York Studio School." And as I came and interviewed with Rob Storr, and right away I felt like I had landed in a really good place. This was a kind of transition time at the school where you had a window back into the past and then into the future to what the school would become. Rob Storr taught a critical theory seminar. They still had the lunch program where we took turns cooking lunch for each other, and we ate together in a lot of passionate discussions about art. I'd like to acknowledge Eyal Danieli, who passed away recently. He was like the Joyce Pensado of that era, living in the school, and he was a very fiery presence, cared deeply about art, and will be very much missed. Graham Nixon became dean the following September and started the drawing marathon that fall. This is a photo from the first one, and I took every subsequent one while I was at the school. They were phenomenally intense workouts where he really shook any complacency out of you. And he taught you how not to be precious about anything on the page. It was all ripe for change. This is likely the first big drawing I made, and it's quite crude, but you can get a sense of what Graham was onto, that he brought Matisse and that kind of drawing to the forefront at the school. This is a slide of me with Helen Miranda Wilson, who is a visiting artist, and this is from a brochure also, so it's what the school chose to commemorate of that era. I had taken some drawing classes before this at the Art Students League and at the New York Academy, so I knew already that those places tend to see drawing as a tool in a toolbox for the artist, a skill to learn, and not as a whole way of thinking and understanding space. Drawing from the model was a mainstay of the school. We spent half of every day doing it. There were different approaches, but it was all about the translation of 3 dimensions into 2, whether it was focusing on the larger physical forces of the rectangle or making the connections between all areas of the image. I took a very important drawing class with Elena Sisto, and it really shaped my understanding of picture making and how I go on to make paintings for the rest of my life. She was very generous to her students and gave them ways of seeing that launched a lot of us. I was a waitress at night at Hawaii 5-0, which is a restaurant in the East Village. It was a magnet for a lot of younger artists, and I got an up-close view of that scene. And then during my last year of school, I got a part-time job at the old Robert Miller Gallery on 57th Street, where John Chime was the director, and it had a phenomenal roster of artists. They were showing early Al Held, early Alex Katz, Louise Bourgeois, Alice Neal. They were pioneers in photography, and during that time, there were shows of Joan Mitchell and Milton Resnick. And they were influential in the way I would make the first paintings that were really my own. This is from my student show I had in my last year. I was interested in the atmosphere around the bottles I had set up on a table, and it began a lifelong interest in atmospheric perspective and a sense of wanting to bring the landscape into other forms of painting. I was trying to convey a kind of openness and energy, and tying that in with observing something in front of me. Joan Mitchell came to my student show with Nathan Kernan and was super supportive, and she, in her generous way, went back to Bob Miller and said, "I really like Elizabeth's work. Can you do something for her?" And about a month later, he said, "We really want to do something for you. Joan likes your work, so we're going to give you a raise from $8 an hour to $10 an hour." Now, I thought that was pretty funny even then. When I left, I went to Skowhegan in the summer of '91, and there's a great transition to the wider world. The resident teachers that summer were Per Kirkeby, Gregory Amanoff, Joan Semmel, and Tom Lanigan-Schmidt. Per said he thought I was really an abstract artist, and Gregory said, "I think you're trying to deconstruct the still life." Remember, this was the heyday of deconstruction. When I was preparing for this talk, I did a wide search for old photos and slides and added to the list of images I usually show when I speak about my work. I found this painting that I made soon after Skowhegan. It has hints of the kind of painting I would make in years to come. It feels big and open to me and solves some of the problems I would come to find in still life and its limits. I'm not sure why I didn't, it's a little washed out, but trust me, the pinks are good in real life. I didn't embrace its possibilities and instead returned to more concrete paintings. I'm obviously doing some fangirl reference to Guston, and I think that soccer ball is meant to be Terry Winter's shape. I also was buying little cartoon character figurines and setting them up. I made this Daffy Duck for a birthday present for John Ashbery, who's a known Daffy aficionado. It's called Daffy Duck with Potatoes. I curated an alumni show at the school where I had a large painting similar to the pink one, and I made a series of super wide paintings referencing the endless landscapes in classic Warner Brothers cartoons. But And I don't know why I didn't continue with those, but instead I took a turn in another direction. I got the idea of putting objects on patterned fabric grounds that I would set up and rake up so I had a kind of continuity of field. I felt it conveyed a sense of ongoing space instead of the limited interiors, something that I was always looking to do. The still life objects I was using during this period came from thinking of fairy tales and the objects that were valuable in them. This first painting is called Spell. I also took a class in 17th and 18th century French novel, reading things like The Princesse de Clèves and Dangerous Liaisons, where I barely had a grasp of what was going on in the book, but I could conjure some of the magical richness, what I imagined was going on. So these are from slides, so the images maybe are not, I don't know, it's not like today's. So after a few years of making these still lifes and showing them in a gallery in Philadelphia and San Francisco, I started to feel a little hemmed in by the size, and I wanted to get a more expansive feeling without lining up a bunch of objects in a row, and I started experimenting with other subject matter. But wait, this is, okay, still a couple more of the, these are still from the still lives. By this time I had married Steve Hicks, who I met here at the studio school, and we had a young family, and I thought I would just embrace this as a time of transition and change and reset my work. So in my studio, I started taking plants and wrapping them up to create bigger forms. And this is a picture of a plant that I wrapped in deli bags. I took those, they have that fabulous pink color, and I took them and cut them up and taped them together and wrapped it around a plant. And then I started wrapping all sorts of things. This is quince blossoms wrapped in plastic. There was only so much I could drag back to my studio. So I started taking photographs of trees. What I loved about the photographs was the color was the emulsion and the way light looked coming through the tree branches. So I started making many works on paper and exploring that. Paper has always been a way ahead of my painting when I want to figure things out. And I started pixelating the forms in light. I made dozens of ink and gouache drawings, some of them very labor intensive. When people asked me what I was doing during this period, I would say research and development. But really, I was teaching myself how to paint abstractly, first by abstracting from observation, and then eventually working from my imagination in the years to come. The work on paper led the way, but eventually in my paintings too, I embraced a real geometric abstraction. I looked at Mondrian and tried to make some reductive paintings, but it came out of me in a kind of exuberant multiplicity. I thought of these as cityscapes in a way, with a reference to the cacophony of buildings I walked past on my way to my studio. And they had a vanishing point and kind of an implied horizon line. I wanted something of the energy of Julie Moretu. I also liked the idea of restraint, that I was the feeling of landscape could be evoked and summoned by holding back, not a literal depiction in the details. This way there was more of a yearning. Frank Stella has those irregular polygon paintings named after towns in New Hampshire. And when I see those paintings, there's a kind of transportation that happens for me that doesn't happen in front of his more frontal work without the suggestive titles. I was listening to a lot of jazz, and I thought of the colors in this works like notes. They would be in a key. I would choose about 6, 7, or 8 of them, mix them up in jars, and bring them backwards and forwards in the painting. Another of the teachers who had a big influence on me in the school was Esteban Vicente and his enigmatic talks about color. He recommended using a limited palette, no earth colors, and that was to keep things from getting muddy and to really have the colors sing. My own take on this was to mix everything. I rarely used colors straight out of the tube and felt this gave me an understanding of what colors could do and their relationships to each other. So I was painting from my head at this point with no direct source material. I started showing at Janet Kernatowski, which was a hotbed of abstraction in Brooklyn, and a great little community of artists. And I also at this time, I was sharing a studio with Trevor Winkfield, and he suggested I make collages and work from them. I started putting cut paper on the floor, not really assembling them. You can see in this painting that part is painted from looking down at a collage, and part has a horizon. So there's a circle, like there had been in the other paintings, of forms as if they're looking in kind of like a moon shape, but then I'm also looking straight down at kind of, I don't know, grass shapes or something. And this painting captured the transition as it was happening in my work. I felt like I was creating landscapes in a kind of creative cartography. This point of view made me think of maps. Most of the paintings were invented places at first. This one reminded me of Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the waterfront near my Dumbo studio and going up the FDR. I started using old maps, which are so beautiful and have much less information on them. This one's called Transatlantic, and I wanted to capture some of the nautical lines and water in old maps. This is from an old map of northern part of Manhattan. Just gonna get some water. Maps gave me the feeling of hovering over any area and having insight into it. This is a collage of Detroit from an old topo map. I made paintings of areas of New York, in Sugar Hill, Hell's Gate, Williamsburg, and realizing that despite all the concrete, that these were coastal areas and in the coming years would be underwater, or could be underwater. I wrote a short essay about my work called Wetlands. I was using a lot of collage at this point and curated a show with Jennifer Samet called Rough Cut, showing the range of ways artists use collage as preliminary material. Carrie Moyer uses collage as a source, a springboard for some of her paintings in a way that's vastly different to Trevor Wigfield, who makes exact replicas of his collage studies. That's the painting that came from that black and white collage. Curating that show affirmed that I could get an idea for a show and make it happen, which I would do later do more in coming years, but it kind of planted the seed. This painting is called Jamaica Bay. This one is from an old map of Williamsburg. There's those two main lines are Broadway and Metropolitan. This one is called Celesteville. Bill Berkson, who lives in San Francisco, this is from a map of San Francisco, and he suggested the title because it has sort of an elephant head shape. It's a little Babar reference. And this is from a map of New Orleans, with kind of some flooding suggested. As much as I tried to inject imaginative responses to the places I was painting, and I felt that there was some distancing about maps and began making some works of my own works from my head. This coincided with a period of about 4 months that I took off after my mother died in 2015 to work on collecting her archive, which was really actually a great period. As much as it felt hard not to paint, it was an appropriate way to mark this period and a privilege to spend time alone in her apartment going through old letters and collections of books. So the paintings I showed you are from the years like 2015 to 2018, and so are the next ones. So I was doing, at the same time as I was still making big map paintings, I started making small paintings that I called a series of landscapes I've started that represent this, that was before. This is the first field painting. Represent the flat open land from Eastern Long Island I remembered as a child. When I said before that I wandered around, there was a kind of freedom to roam around unsupervised then, but say between the ages of 9 and 14. We would walk through the farm fields and knock on people's door to do odd jobs for money, for the penny candy. And then you could just go up to someone's house and no one would kidnap you. And this open time came back to me. I was invoking the land out there, but in my own language. I had introduced tape to make lines in the map paintings and then carried over into these. The tape was seductive because I could paint ground colors and peel it off and have a surprising result. So it was hard to give it up, but I began to feel that the tape moved through the paintings too fast and I wanted something more personal. So these are And this is one of the last paintings I would make with tape. I began making some stream of consciousness ink drawings, like blind drawings, hovering over a page, seeing an equivalency between blank paper and an empty field. The first ones I made, I was really almost closing my eyes and probing, imagining myself over a field as if I could draw with a giant stick in the dirt and then circle up in the air. I was at a dinner for birthday dinner for my friend Jennifer Syrie, and David Humphrey was asking me what I was working on. I told him I was making these very improvisational ink and watercolor drawings, and then I added that I wasn't making paintings from them. And then about 2 nights later, in the middle of the night, I woke up and said, oh, that's what I should be doing. So here are the first paintings I made from the drawings. So I think you can see, so that I can go back just if you want. So this one, and this one led to this one and this one. I felt like this practice, like stream of consciousness writing, allows me to tap into imagery I wouldn't have accessed otherwise. A few months before this, in the winter of 2017, I saw the Gorky landscape show Art and Nature at Hauser and Wirth. The way he evoked landscapes with burnished color areas, but not too much, and he moved around the picture from the foreground and created strange vertical shapes that are possibly trees or machines was very liberating. I saw how little it took to suggest landscape and how strange vertical forms could feel natural in that place, no matter what they were, and there was a lot of room to play. Using watercolor, no matter how off-label I was doing it, had a huge influence on my oil paintings. Watercolor not only expanded my palette into all sorts of seemingly unnameable colors, but I aimed to capture the feeling of, and the flood of color, the lightness. I got a grant and I spent it on art supplies and colors I had never used. And I feel now like when I use tube color directly, I know how to let it roar, so to speak, by having mostly mixed colors around it and using it purposefully. I also did a series of monoprints at Jungle Press that gave me a kind of kick forward. Something about the pressure of having to quickly drive to capture what you were after with other people around was an eye-opening experience. Compared to using tape, the ink drawings as a source has led to a return to plasticity that I was lacking, I think, and I can lean into now. The ink lines function as a narrator that take you around the picture. I want the sense of movement they offer combined with a flood of color. I want to make paintings that engulf you when you first look at them and invite you to stay and travel around over the time. I took stock of what I loved about calligraphic abstraction to see what I could add and make my own. I love paintings that have overall movement, like Pollock or Bryce Martin or even Kelty Ferris, but I wanted to retain the flow and lyricism that they have, but to create a sense of place so that each painting is distinct from the others. This has me sometimes feeling like I'm reinventing the wheel with each painting, but I think overcoming those challenges has this payoff. I wanted to depict a time of day, a storm, to create a definite place where this is unfolding, even if the imagery is slightly fantastical and surreal. There was a major news of forest fires in 2018 and 19, and you could feel their looming presence coming. These paintings were made in response. We took a trip to Samos, Greece, where there was a forest fire in Turkey right nearby, and the crazy cloud shapes it made in the skies mirrored shapes I had invented. This confirmed now that the climate pushed to extremes. You can't invent things that aren't also happening. My imagination is matching nature's forces. There's a shock of recognition. I can paint things off kilter and they ring true.
Calling emergency services.
Raphael Rubinstein wrote an essay about my work where he began with both Gerard Manley Hopkins and Edvard Munch seeing the same fiery and sublime skies after a volcanic eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, and how the atmospheric conditions, quote, can match the artist's overheated imagination. I'm going to quote him a little bit because I love what he wrote. Looking at Elizabeth Hazen's recent paintings, abstractions in which rich colors, by turns verdant, aqueous, mineral, or fragrant, are embodied in arrays, in various arrays, odd, soft-edged shapes, held gently within skeins of meandering lines, it's not hard to ponder the role of atmosphere, the place of air in our perception of the world around us. So often in her work, it feels like we are looking at a landscape through a haze of a summer day or the mist of a damp dew, discerning fields and trees refracted through some diaphanous cloud of suspended particles, dust or moisture, smoke or pollen. Well, what is paint after all but suspended particles of color in which we gaze? So the thing about Long Island light, the famous Long Island light that de Kooning said reminded him of the Netherlands, is that it's filled with moisture, and you can sense the presence of air more heavily than you can in the dry, clear air out west. And I think this is true in the city, even as we are an island, although we often forget it. There are two Joan Mitchell quotes that are important to me. One from the terribly named bio lady painter, is that she said her whole life she felt she was painting the weather coming across Lake Michigan. And the other is, quote, I paint from remembered landscapes that I carried with me and remembered feelings of them, which of course become transformed. I could never, certainly never mirror nature. I would like more to paint with what it leaves me. Most of my paintings come from drawings, but not all. Sometimes I look at a painting I made and see other possibilities, options that I didn't choose. Or sometimes I just feel I need to make a yellow one. All of the larger paintings start from smaller version. I do this freehand so that each one is different. I like the freshness this invites, and I'm still solving problems as I work so that you're seeing into the mind of the artist. The kind of work I respond to most has this sense of time, that paintings breathe and change rather than feeling like they're all pinned down at once. So you can see this is the next version of that same painting. Oops, sorry, just go back. Even though my work is very different than Elena Sisto, one of the things I got from her is there's a quote from Guston about forms emerging from the background, not just executed on top of one. She and Guston both have more of a secret sauce that the painting is coming from. My work doesn't have the same physicality, but I hope that there's a hint of gestation. The vertical format allows me to have room to play with both a ground and a sky area, although I like to move and tilt in a range of point of view. My friend Margaret Boyer, who's a photographer, told me it's a concept in photography that horizontals represent the world, how we see the world, and verticals are ideas. This is a diptych that I made to try to get away from. So I thought I can make a square, and then I could put two squares together. And that gave me an idea that I think I will be able eventually to confront a horizontal, but I haven't yet. These are some really recent paintings. I like to read writers talking about their own process of writing. We're all trying to establish a voice in our own mediums. Writers get to work with editors, and artists have to learn to do it for themselves. Being a good editor for yourself is often the hallmark of a great editor and something we all aspire to master. The fantastic short story writer Deborah Eisenberg, talking about writing, said, when you add a comma or add or subtract a word and the whole thing reacts and changes, it's so exciting you forget how absolutely terrible writing feels most of the time. This excitement is something painters get to feel often. I think it's a more generous medium to its practitioners, and happily there are useful accidents that occur, and I'm so grateful to be able to do it. Here are some glimpses at current paintings and some paintings in my studio. These will be an upcoming show at the Madu Conservancy in Sagaponack, and then in One Gap in May. And I hope you come see them in the flesh because of course, I just had a Brooklyn accent for a second, because of course that's different, and that's how paintings were meant to be seen. So I purposely left a lot of time for questions because I'd rather answer your questions than go on any longer. Thank you.
so much. Do we have any questions in the audience? I have one to get us started, if you don't mind, if I may. Or do we? Oh, here we go. Great.
So Elizabeth, you've begged the obvious question. And I don't know whether we should just keep saving it, keep letting it lurk in the background, but your parents' painting, and especially like, I guess like most of us, I know your mom's painting and don't really know your dad's, but you weren't gonna necessarily be a painter. And then I'm curious, especially about the time when you decided you would be, and how did you talk to your parents about that?
How did I break it to them?
Yeah.
Like, I came out. No, I mean, you know, it's funny because my dad really wanted me to be a doctor, even though I had no interest in science. And I always thought that's so weird. And now, of course, now I understand. He just wanted a doctor because we all would love someone to call in the middle of the night. I think my parents had, you know, my mom had a very Chekhovian worldview. Everything was difficult. And even though she herself, she had an amazingly easy time showing. I mean, she really started showing when she was in her 20s, and kind of like the Beatles, learned through doing. She showed and painted at the same time, and it really helped that she was a natural. But she did say to me, I would be nowhere without poets. Like, they got me the shows, Frank O'Hara would stretch her canvases. And so I think that she definitely, you know, I think they felt, oh, you're choosing something hard and it's going to take a long time. And that, but you know, we get it. I think does that answer your question? I didn't know if you know more specifically, like how I was going to play catch up, because.
I'm guessing most of us would like a longer answer.
I'll follow up your question for a longer answer. So you're painting and they get it, and it's, but I think I'll just go ahead and say this. One of the things I know you said to me was that, oh, they're so happy that your painting isn't like their painting. And that was a little bit of a relief. But what I'm interested in, and I think it's also pretty obvious, because Jane, most of you know that Jane, her mother, has an amazing show up right now, which is just flat out, it depicts a period of time for Jane in between her early and late work, just 2 or 3 years of abstract landscape painting from her head. And so Elizabeth isn't painting like her parents, but her mother dies and all of a sudden starts painting abstract landscape paintings from her head. Now I know they're very different, but maybe you can kind of talk about how there's the psychological thing that we can skip, like your mother dies and now you're allowed to do this, but more like comparing. I think it'd be interesting, sort of, because you're you know, on a surface you're painting abstractly Long Island landscapes from your head. Your mother's were horizontal, yours are vertical, and I'll just discuss.
Well, I did say that I think it was a relief to my mother and everyone else that my work wasn't exactly like hers, because there certainly were other artists who painted exactly like her. But obviously we were in the same terrain, like I wasn't making video. And I think that this group of paintings, I hope everyone will go see this. She has a phenomenal show at Casman. And it's a group of abstract paintings that she made when she had first started spending a lot of time out in Long Island and then didn't have a studio there. So she came back and painted them in New York. And I think the difference is that she was trying to capture what it felt like to be out there, and without details, they came out abstractly. I mean, she was obviously also influenced in the current, you know, lingua franca of the day, but I think it was really a project to distill the essence into painting of the light out there. And I think when mine are much more imaginative possibilities that spring from it. I mean, the shapes I make are not ones that you see out there. And yes, I'm trying to capture something, but it's like I just feel like it's like I'm growing a crop or something. It's a different response, and mine are more improvisational. But I hope that there's something similar, because I think her paintings are so sensational, and I would love to think that I learned something from her.
Hello. I am a student here currently, and I just wanted to, well, I have a question, but I also really appreciated that you did include the images from starting at the New York Studio School, especially from your first marathon. And I do see, being a first year as well, and being in that, I really appreciate it also because I do see that lineage from your, drawing like Matisse, and the lines and the colors that you're using and the shape in your current work. And the question that I had, because I hear this a lot, of why for you, your relationship to paint directly out of the tube, like more specifically, because you are like, I really admire the way that you put color down on the canvas. So why specifically that feels like a tumultuous relationship for you, and also how you approach your color palette. Is it purely imaginative, or is there kind of a reactional, I guess, of, putting down a blue and then going towards pinks? Or is there more of a plan when you're going from painting to painting?
Well, a lot of these paintings start with watercolors, and I really, the choices are sometimes spontaneous, and then I'm trying to mirror that with oil paint. But even when I'm not using that as a foundation, I do think it's kind of improvisational. I certainly don't do color studies or anything, or think about it in terms of value. I guess it's a responsive thing. I'd be like, okay, I really want to start with this color and what can go with it, and then I add things. I tend to mix a lot of color, like even I just knock things down a little bit or push them this way and that way. I think it just works better. And then as I said, now I am using some straight color. I guess I didn't show it. There's like one with a huge burnt umber cloud, and I was like, oh, I didn't know burnt umber could do that if he had just a big, they're just colors that I guess, when I first was painting, like everything was sap green and alizarin crimson, and I just didn't, I don't know, I felt like you having a more limited palette of, I could tell you after, but this certainly is like every cadmium yellow, and orange and red, and then, so those colors can often be on their own, but like everything else was at first was mixed from those, like any earth color. And so now I have a lot, I think you saw in this, I have a lot of paint, and I'm so, happy that there's so many colors out there. It's really a discovery, and all the things that they can do.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hey, Sharon.
It's nice to see you up there. I have a question. You kind of glossed over that part about having kids, and you said, I embraced the transition, I think you said. It was a transitional period. I embraced the transition. And this is something I've been thinking about lately, because I had a bit of an argument with someone about how having kids, really impacted my work in a really important way. And I said it impacts everyone's work in an important way, and she absolutely disagreed. And so I'm wondering, and you had quite a few kids. So first of all, I'm just curious how, the transition maybe came about through having kids, but then also, how did raising the kids, and I don't mean when they're babies, because everybody knows that's hard, but like when they sort of reach the teenage years and all, did they impact your work in any way in terms of content or process, or was it just sort of something that you did and it's never the two shall meet? Well,
I didn't paint at home, so it was actually pleasure to get out of the house and go to a studio, no matter how short that was. And I had a terrific partner who really shared the time with me. And of course, there were many, many sleep-deprived nights, and that doesn't end when you have teenagers. Is almost another whole thing that happens, especially if you let them have parties. But I mean, I think it just took me longer. I mean, I was just talking to Elisa Jensen about this the other day. I mean, I put my head down and worked the whole time. I didn't stop working, but I did let other things go. And I felt like maybe the length of time it took to work through different, to teach myself how to paint abstractly probably took a lot longer. I mean, these days it feels like MFA students emerge, full bore from grad school like Athena coming out of the head of Zeus. Like they are fully formed. Maybe they're formed before they go and then they change a little, but anyway. And if you're doing that and you're 20 something and then you have start your career and have a kid when you're already sort of somewhere, I think it's probably a really much more doable thing to what I did was, I guess, I just improvised my way through it, but I said like, okay, well, I want to change my work. No one's looking at it right now. So I'm just going to take the time I need to play around and make it happen. But I was listening to this interview with Lenny Kravitz the other day, and he's the same age as me and some friends. And he said, you do something for 30 years and you start to feel like this is the way it was meant to be, and you've gotten to the place you were meant to get to. So I guess that's what he meant.
I'm going to add something to that. No, because the thing is, because I'm her husband. But it was true. It's like we kept painting, like with the kids. I mean, the kids didn't affect our paintings in what we were painting, but the truth is that, how you paint for 60% of the time and then the other 40% you market yourself or go look to other shows. We just gave up that 40%. We were hibernating. We didn't know what was going on in the art world, but we were painting. And it was true. It's like research and development. No one's looking at it. We're just keeping our head, just above water. That was sort of like that.
Well, I feel like I knew a little bit about what was going on, but not as much as other people.
You weren't showing other people's work.
In addition to your lovely husband here, it's nice to meet you. Thank you so much for talking tonight. What else has your community of artist peers look like over the course of your career? Do you have poets around?
Well, I've certainly been to many, many poetry readings, and I do know a fair number, but it's true, I don't know. Well, it's true. I guess I have had some poets in my corner. I actually, when I was doing all this, I found a really nice note from Joe Brainerd saying, I loved your student show at the studio school. My circle, so I have friends who I met at the studio school that are still my friends, Jeannie, and at Skowhegan. And then I have sort of picked up friends. I have, a Yaddo friend, like one has, different, artists you meet along the way, and I still feel like I'm making peers. I think that it's true that graduate school, I didn't go to graduate school, but I was along when my husband did. And I think, you get a cohort and they really help you, endure the slings and arrows.
Elizabeth, we have an online question about improvisation. I know you touched upon that a little bit with your use of color. And the question is about the sort of translation that happens between the smaller works and the bigger works, and how much room there is to improvise, or what that experience of translation is like for you.
Well, the ones that start from the drawings, I'm really, in the drawings, I think you could see, I'm almost have my eyes closed in some of them. I mean, I'm really like a blind drawing, something, blind figure drawings always come out so much better than anything else. And I wanted something of that. And it really does help you tap into some kind of part of your brain that I think what's changed in my work is that it's gotten a lot more personal through being open to being a little bit vulnerable and accepting of what comes out. So I think that I'm more in improvisational stage when I'm on with a blank piece of paper. And then the reason I don't project is because I don't want to do something exactly. I want to have a translation from each version so that I can find things in the painting as I'm doing it and change them and show the viewer how I'm changing it.
Sorry, can you pass this down?
Hi, Elizabeth. Can you talk about how line work has evolved in your paintings? It's you use line in a very important. It adds a lot to the paintings. Let's put it that way. And I'm thinking, like, when the work was more geometric, there was still strong line work, and now I'm seeing maybe a more broken line work, and it's adding a kind of new energy to the work. And I was just wondering if you can talk about how line work has evolved in your paintings.
Yeah, well, because I'm using mostly black ink, sometime, and when I was using tape before, mostly because I'm using black ink, there's a tendency for the lines to get very strong if I want to keep that. And so sometimes I'm doing that at first in the painting and then taking them down. And sometimes I don't even realize how overpowering they are. And so I do try to change the color of the line. I find that I have a variety of approaches. Sometimes the line divides the color, and those tend to work best. And sometimes I segment colors with line. I do think, I'm glad you said that I'm breaking it up a little, because I don't want it to overpower it. Yet I do feel like the line is an important element of movement, and I like line in other people's work. I mean, I curated a show called Walk the Line that had a lot of artists I love and how they use line, because I feel like it gets me around and gets me some movement. But on the other hand, there's like the color, there's like, if you think of the Florence and Venice thing, I want both. I want to be Titian and, I don't know, who's the other one, Michelangelo? Who's the example? Well, anyway, the Florentine.
Hi. I was struck, and I can't get it out of my mind, the Popeye painting, because there was something about that seems like is in every recent painting. And it's the shape of Popeye, the curves of the Popeye face. And then there was another like little abstract curvy shape that kind of mirrored that. And between that and the fact that like all of those early paintings seem to be looking down at something, and it seems like that you establishing a point of view for a viewer that isn't just a confrontational point of view, but it is like a constructed pictorial looking down point of view. It doesn't have to be looking down, but I think in your case it always is. And I was wondering if you had some kind of idea about, psychologically why you adopt that, point of view.
That's a good question. I mean, I have to say, I was sort of blown away when I saw that painting. I had completely forgotten about it. There was another painting that I did remember kind of that wasn't as good. And, I had to actually ask a very nice person to scan some slides. And so I only picked a few. And I was like, holy shit, I could have saved a long time if I had only known what was in this painting. And I do, I see a lot of, but the point of view, it's a really good question, Dennis. I think that it offers, I feel like looking down, I get the freedom of, when I put the canvas on the floor, it's how I paint, and I use my whole arm, I feel like a big freedom to make those moves. And then I also feel like the viewer starts off looking down and then looks up. I mean, I kind of got that from Gorky, but I was so relieved that people were willing to accept my weird space when I made them.
It's kind of a power, it's kind of psychologically a power thing. I mean, you're looking down on something, so it puts you in the air, sort of, and it also gives you like a feeling of control, like all these little things are like at your disposal or something.
Well, when I was making the more map paintings, I really did feel like, oh, we're all hovering these days. I mean, I felt like, because Google Earth and different things, we all have this sort of sense of traveling in our computers, and we can all, this aerial point is affecting our culture, and I'm just one of the people who is being affected by it.
You've been doing it since the beginning.
Yeah, well, I didn't know that, see? I don't know. I guess I'd like it. I feel.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I'm scared to share, but the color is fantastic. I paint very representationally, so I really I liked all your slides, but the first ones with the glasses, they were almost like you decided, I'm going to paint this still life in circles, all circles. Do you have any suggestions on someone who paints representationally to how they can loosen up a little?
It's a good question. I think that you should just see that there's it doesn't take a lot to suggest a little, and so the viewer will go with you. You don't really need to depict everything fully. I think I'd leave that to some of the people here who are really good teachers to answer that question better. But I guess I don't have a better answer right now than just to trust yourself and not feel that you have to in order to capture something, just what is the most the first thing about the shape that you want, and you don't have to do everything else. And also, I would try blind drawings. I mean, I think that something comes out when you're like, you capture psychologically and also the kind of the placement better than your maybe I have a strong corrective brain, and that's why I really like it, because it frees me from that.
And I think we have time for one more question. Did I see a hand?
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to mention, I think it was in the part of your presentation where it was when you said you had children, and then you showed a few artworks where it was like a plant or something, and then it was like enveloped. And I found those so interesting, and it made me wonder if it had to do with the fragility of bringing a new life into the world, and the fragility of, like, what's going to take care of your child, how is your child going to, I just wondered, in my mind, I was imagining connections that somehow those things were connected. We're probably not supposed to psychoanalyze, but I just wanted to mention that. I like them. I found them very interesting. And I also love Popeye, of course.
I never thought of that. I mean, I never thought of that wrapping something was like swaddling something. I don't know, maybe you're onto, I really was just experimenting and just wanted to change. I guess I had been painting things that were small, and I wanted to paint something big, and I was like, well, if I wrap something, I'll have some weird forms to paint, and yeah.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you, everyone.
And And again, please join us down in the clay room for light refreshments. And tomorrow evening, we'll have a special panel on Chandler, who's the artist who decorated the original Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney studio here at the studio school, and we'll be open after that panel discussion to tour that space as well. So please come back tomorrow night. Thank you.